Probably millions.
It's the first time I've done anything like this.
We'll see. We'll see. I see people joining, so in a couple of minutes we'll start. Hello, everyone who's joining. We're still waiting for people, right? It's only 2 o'clock exactly, so let's give everyone a minute to join before we start. Hello, Konstantin. I see people from probably all around the world joining. Of course, Canada is present. So everyone joining, let's start in maybe 45 seconds. We still see the counter going up. That means people are still joining. How's your day going, Todd?
I am doing well. Got my
Excellent.
coffee. All set.
I'm really happy to hear that. Well, maybe let's give it 20 more seconds. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Cypress webinar. I'm Gleb Bahmutov, VP of Engineering at Cypress.io, and with me we have a special guest, Todd Williams from GoFundMe. Todd, how are you? Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Gleb. This is great.
Todd, you're a QA engineer, right? How long have you worked at GoFundMe?
I've been at GoFundMe for about 3 years.
In different roles or just as a single role?
In a couple of different roles, as a project manager and a product manager, but I've landed on QA engineering.
Yeah, and now we have a product, right? The quality, that's what
That's right.
I hear you, I hear you. So for our listeners, you can ask Todd and me questions based on the material we show in this webinar by going to Slido and using event code SciGoFundMe. Again, you go to Slido, SLI.do, and you enter the event code SciGoFundMe. And you can upvote other people's questions that you find interesting or ask your own question. This webinar will be recorded, and recording will be sent in an email to everyone who has registered. And we also will post it on a page on our site. So without further ado, Todd, why don't you take away, show us how GoFundMe uses Cypress to test.
Great, thanks, Gleb. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Todd Williams, QA automation engineer at GoFundMe. I got my start in video games over 10 years ago and moved into web 5 years ago when I became an automation engineer with a company called CrowdRise, which eventually became GoFundMe Charity. So just a quick bit about the company. GoFundMe Charity is a subscription-free fundraising platform with powerful tools to make fundraising easy for charities. So you might already know GoFundMe as the platform for everyday people to create a fundraising campaign for themselves or a friend or organization. And GoFundMe Charity is a similar platform, except it's built for charities to create their own fundraising campaigns. Here's a few of the charities that we work with: American Heart Association, Boston and New York Marathons, American Cancer Society, LLS, and American Red Cross. And then I'll give a quick look at some of the tools that we offer to charities. So here's a customizable donate button that you can embed in your website. And with this, you'd be able to accept donations for your charity, and we would handle the donation processing and receipts and everything like that.
It's a modern web application, right?
Yeah. We have a robust report center that provides data on all of the donations the charities received. We have branded campaign pages and a small version of like a website builder to be able to customize these. And customizable event pages that can include tickets as well as donations for charities that would want to host a gala or for the marathons like Boston and New York. So there are lots of options, lots of customizations, plus data management and a few things I didn't cover. And of course, you'd be able to sign in, update your profile, claim your charity, create campaigns, make donations. So all of that means that there's a lot to QA.
I see. So a lot of user stories.
Yes. So some quick stats. Here's where we were at the end of 2019. If anyone remembers, that's when the world seemed to end.
It's like BC, before Corona.
That's right. Okay, so our full test suite took 5 hours to run, which means that we would set up our test environment during the day. We'd trigger the test suite to run overnight, and then we'd check out the results the next morning. It's about 1,000 tests. That's not great for quick feedback on a new feature, of course. We did have a smaller set of critical tests that we could run before deployment. Those took about 30 minutes, but that's not ideal either.
Agree.
We had enough test flake caused by brittle code and poor coding practices that we'd consistently see about 10% of our tests failing. It's about 100 tests. And that's not to say that the same tests kept failing over and over. That was a random 100 tests that would fail this time and maybe pass the next time.
Right. So people probably ignore the failed QA run because it's like, yeah, something usually fails.
Yeah, it was often easy to say, to just ignore the failures. And the code was really difficult to debug and update, partially because of the tools that we were using, partly because of the practices, partly because a lot of us were new to coding entirely, which I find is not uncommon in the QA field. And then, of course, when we would fix a few things, when we wanted to run the full suite of tests again, that's another 5-hour overnight session. So we said we need to do something about this. Okay, so we said, what are we going to focus on? If we're going to make a change, let's be sure that we have a North Star to guide us when we make this change. So number one, let's get developers to write some tests. At the time, QA engineers were the only ones writing tests. And in this case, like integration and end-to-end tests, the developers were writing some unit and component testing, but largely unaware of the tests in the automation repo that were handled by the QA engineers. So we figured that if developers are writing tests too, then that can help out in all sorts of ways. They can become familiar with the test suite. They can help ensure good coding practices. And since they're the ones developing the features, they should be the ones testing the features. And that's obviously not a new idea, but we wanted to see how well we could adopt it. And second focus is we wanted to be more confident about the tests that we were running. 100 failures on any given test run does not inspire confidence in your test, especially when you run the test again and you get a different set of failures. At that point, the tests just seem useless. Why are you testing at all? If you run a test and you don't know if it's going to pass or fail from one time to the next, that's a worthless test. So we needed to know for sure that green meant good and red means we've got an issue. So these two things will be the main points that I want to talk about. Number one, how we got developers to write tests. And number two, how we gain confidence with our test suite. Okay, first part of our focus, getting developers to write tests. So we used to kick off projects and developers would start setting up what they were going to need, installing libraries, refactoring this or that, updating the API to add some new endpoints maybe. And meanwhile, the QA engineer would be adding and updating automation for the release that just went out. So they were a little behind the current development. And eventually developers had enough of whatever new feature developed to a point where the QA engineer could jump in and start writing some tests. A bit of a waterfall approach. Then QA gets pressured to release the feature since it's code complete and the devs have moved on to the next feature. And so there's always that offset between developers and QA. So we wanted to be more agile, but we were stuck in this kind of waterfall approach. And I'm using the term developers here to differentiate those engineers whose main focus is on building features versus like QA engineers for testing. Anyway, we found this great set of articles and talks on how Atlassian approaches QA. I'd highly recommend it. You can Google this, how Atlassian does QA, or the link is there on the screen, /inside Atlassian/QA. But from this, we started thinking about QA in a more supportive role. So in other words, let's have the developers write the tests, and what can QA do to help the developers with their testing? So we said they can help create the test plan, define test cases. They can help architect the test, get it into the right state with before hooks and support methods. We can add stubs and mocks and pseudocode. And then once a feature is built to a point where QA would have normally just been starting, now all the developers have to do is really fill in the blanks.
I really like this approach, Todd. I really found this to be the key, because many people don't kind of say Cypress replaces QA, but they suspect that it will replace. And we think it's not. It just allows QA to step up and actually be a mentor and establish good practices and actually help others, right? Rather than just write tests, which is like the lowest thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's a little like cooking. We see QA as kind of helping gather the ingredients and do the chopping and measuring, get the mise en place, and then the developers do the actual cooking, right? It's
really good analogy. Really good analogy.
Okay, so quick pause to see how involved the developers are in the QA process.
Yeah, for those who don't know, if you go to slider.com, enter GoFundMe, this poll is ongoing right now. You can pick an option that describes your organization. Certainly, in many organizations, devs write some kind of tests, right? There is very little, I think, where it's just exclusively the purpose of QAs. Do the poll numbers surprise you, Todd, or did you expect it this way?
No, I think this seems about right. Little to some of QA. It seems like most. Mm-hmm. I'm surprised to see maybe 20% devs and QA are one and the same. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's because it's a smaller organization and they don't have QA, or maybe they've got this figured out already, which would be
exactly.
Great.
Or it's more like Holy Trinity, right? It's 3 different people, but they're all one and the same.
Right, right.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for answering. Thanks for answering the poll.
Yeah, great. Okay, so we'll carry on. Okay, so we said if we're going to push for developers to write tests, we need to question why they aren't writing tests already. So here's a couple of things that I've heard. One, it takes too much time. So we just said that if QA can take a more supportive role, getting everything set up quickly, and that can help testing move more quickly, and developers can just fill in the blanks. So QA can help alleviate that setup time. Another thing we've heard is that developers aren't good at testing. Maybe they figure they just don't have the mind for it. And again, that's no problem. QA has brilliant test-centric minds. So we can help create the test plan from the start and that takes a lot of the weight off of developers to think about what they're going to need to test, and we can help make sure that the edge cases don't get missed. Maybe they're just not used to writing tests. So if QA is going to be creating a framework for the developers to fill in the blanks, then developers are going to be starting with failing or pending tests, and they need to update them. And so that should help create a new habit. We're not going to ship code with failing tests or pending tests. So QA kind of makes it imperative that tests get written, whether it's by the developer or QA. When they're there from the start, that helps. And this is kind of similar to test-driven development idea of red-green refactor, where you start with a failing test, you make the test pass, and then refactor. So I wouldn't consider it a substitute for that process, but it is similar. QA would be doing the first part, the red part, right? And then there's the idea that writing tests isn't very fun. And to this, I'd say that writing tests in Selenium isn't very fun, or it wasn't fun for me anyway, but maybe there's a better way. So we've got an idea of the process that we're going to update. QA is going to help build a test suite early that will then be finished by the developers. But what tools should we use? We need a solution that works for both developers and QA and can fit into this new process. So we took a look at the tools that we were currently using at the time, and we said, does this solution work for everyone? Can we teach everyone to use these tools and use them effectively? The core of our automation was Selenium, of course, PHP WebDriver, and PHP Unit. So this is great. It's easy enough. It's already in PHP. Our backend is in PHP. So maybe we just learned some of the nuances of Selenium and we're all set to go, right? If you're laughing, it's because you know it can be pretty difficult to learn to write solid Selenium tests. The nuances there's a lot of them. Maybe you guys are pros and you've got it figured out, but this seemed pretty daunting to me right off the bat, teaching Selenium. But maybe that's okay if that's all we had to do. But of course, we also needed Paratest for testing in parallel. And we use Sauce Labs for cross-browser support and Test Lodge for viewing results and documenting tests. And so we need to get everyone accounts on those platforms and teach them the ins and outs of those tools as well as Selenium. And on top of that, we had a custom utilities package that we'd built that had all sorts of support methods for finding text and clicking on buttons, verifying this and that, which wasn't documented at all. And we use Swagger CodeGen to help us integrate the API into our tests. And of course, a whole host of other packages and libraries to connect to the database and all sorts of things. So the bottom line is that this was a lot of work to set up and to maintain. And here's a true story. I once spent over an hour trying to set up a couple of new engineers just to run a single test in that framework, and I couldn't do it. It was too complex. There were too many different requirements. Getting it all installed was a nightmare. And we were using Composer, so I'm not even sure why it was so bad. But once everything was installed, we had to update config files to be able to run the test locally or use Sauce Labs and spin up Selenium servers and run the tests in parallel. It was terrible. So I'm ashamed to admit, but they never did get set up to run tests.
Todd, I feel like you have a flashback, and I don't want you to like have a nightmare again.
It was bad. I'm one of the only ones that can run these tests.
So you're irreplaceable. It's a good job security.
There you go. That's something. Well, so we said if QA engineers are having trouble with this, there's no way we're going to get developers on board. We need a new solution. So this should come as no surprise since you're watching a Cypress webinar, but we landed on using Cypress. We had looked into keeping Selenium, but using Mocha and Chai instead of PHP Unit. We checked out Nightwatch, Codeception, Selenide, Catalan, and Cypress. And we created some quick proofs of concept and ran through some of the pros and cons of each. And pretty quickly, we knew that Cypress was the winner. It combined everything that we needed into a single tool that felt familiar, but was easy to teach and use. And it was really well documented. It had parallel testing, dashboard for viewing results, So that got rid of paratest and test lodge. It had in-browser debugging, DOM snapshots. It's in JavaScript, which is great. And it's really readable. And of course, best of all, the setup is easy. npm install Cypress. Of course, in our case, it's Yarn. Okay, so now we've got a new process that QA takes a more supportive role, and a new tool, Cypress. So we'll see how they can work together. So here's a quick example of a new sign up and sign in feature. And this is loosely based on GoFundMe Charity's sign up, sign in feature. So we'll say that this feature lives in the same app at the same URL, and we'll keep these tests in the same spec file. And for these example purposes, we'll just cover the happy path. So let's say we just got the requirements for this feature, maybe a bit of design. And so at this point, QA can start thinking through the tests and jotting them down for the spec file. And this is easy enough. Everyone, including PM, should be able to read and write this that you see here. So everyone should be able to contribute to tests like this and sign off on these. But this is where QA can really get going and shine, is at the beginning. So here we've decided that these are the important tests that we want to automate. Users can create a new account, and users can log in as a charity, and users can log in as a human. And at GoFundMe Charity, we have two types of accounts, one for charities, of course, and one for regular users that we call humans. So we start by wrapping these in describe blocks to differentiate them. And then by not providing a callback in the it methods, these are just marked pending when you run them, which means that they'll show up, but they won't be passing or failing just yet.
This is just placeholder to be filled later.
It's a great way to get things in without as comments, right? It feels more permanent than comments.
Yeah, it's more permanent, yeah.
So since both of these features are going to live on the same page at the same URL, we can create a before each block to visit the page. We know that this is going to be necessary. And whether or not we know the actual route, here we did know the route, but we can create a variable to fill this in later, or maybe we can guess at the route and then fill it in later. So from the imaginary designs and requirements, by default, users are going to land on the sign in form. So in order to get to sign up, they have to click the sign up button. And so that needs to happen before any sign up test. So we can create a before each block for that. And for the sign in tests, we'll need to have an existing charity user to be able to test logging in as a charity. And we want to have an existing human user to be able to test logging in as a human. So we don't need to create these during the test. We want to create these before we run the test. And I'll pause here to say that for us at GoFundMe, we haven't found an easy way to seed the database. And we don't want to rely on existing data, since that can get out of sync pretty quickly. So we actually set up everything from scratch in every spec file. It adds a little time overall, but it ensures that we've got the right state going into every test. And we'll revisit that a little later on as a kind of best practice for us. So in this case, we start by creating a describe block to differentiate the charity from the human user. And then we use the API to quickly create a new charity user. We've already got a setup script for that, sci.charitySetup. So we throw that into the before block since we only need one user, and assign the resulting charity user to a variable that we can use for any of the charity login tests.
So you create reuser just once, and then reuse it in all the tests in that block.
Right. And we do the same thing for the human user. So nice and organized. Something to note here then is that a developer who's unfamiliar with our code, if they wanted to write this test, they may not know that we've already got these support functions to create charity users and human users. And so by QA helping set them up like this, we're helping them learn what those different support methods are that are specific to us. And of course, if we didn't already have these support functions, this would be something that QA could jump in and create early on and get merged into master, since it's not reliant on any aspect of this new feature. So we can get those ready to go. And then if we really want to lay it out for the developers, maybe we want to be sure that they don't miss an assertion. We can help them write some steps. And I'll usually do this in comments just below the account. Of course, if you wanted to make this an actual test, you could do that as well.
We actually recommend this, right? Just write the comments roughly. That's what we do during Cypress workshops. We have pre-filled tests that just have comments, just like you have, right? Almost like instructions. To me, this almost look like instructions you would write to a manual tester, right? Go to the page, enter email and password, click submit, right? And the human will perform them. In this case, you just writing comments for you to perform for Cypress later.
Yeah, yeah. And again, this probably depends on how well your developers are at writing tests. If they don't feel like they're any good at it, or again, if we want to be sure that we assert a response from the API, maybe that's something that they're not thinking of. Then we can make sure that we include those here. And then now that we've got the test set up, QA can take a step back and we can do more of a check-in approach. So we can watch for code reviews and make sure that developers are using some of the best practices that we're aware of from Cypress and from QA. Of course, they can help keep coding best practices in general. And QA can also help keep the spec files up to date as the requirements for the feature are changing.
I see. So this is a good point, right? You add features, you have to add corresponding tests. If you follow the same model, you probably, when you think about additional feature, you again start with empty tests, right? And iterate as before.
Yeah, exactly. And by having QA do this with more of a mindset towards testing, it helps make sure that those things aren't missed. You know, again, it is as a developer whose main focus is maybe building the features. When you see a small change come in, maybe you just go and you make the change and you don't think about how that affects the test.
Right, right.
Okay, so quick review, how to get developers to write tests, at least how we got some of the developers to write tests. And this is by no means, this is just what's worked for us so far. This is no means, you know, the solution for everyone. So we started by providing better tools, thanks to Cypress. We help set up the tests so that developers can work quickly and start thinking about testing if they weren't already. And finally, we provide continued support, calling out best practices, building the support functions, and watching for updates to the requirements.
Yeah, so you take an approach of kind of, if you provide better experience to developers, they will actually see the value in writing tests, and it's not going to be something they postpone until it falls off because of deadline. I really like this.
That's a great point. Yeah, I do feel like the developers, as it's a better experience. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, and an approach of write test or you'll be fired definitely will not work.
That's right. Okay, so the second focus of this is how to gain confidence with our tests. So here we took a look at a bunch of different articles and blog posts, a lot of them from Gleb, actually. He's got a great blog. Both the Cypress blog and his personal blog are great. But we started to gather some ideas of some best practices that would help make sure that we had more confidence in our tests this time around. So I'll list them out here and then we'll get into them more in depth individually. And hopefully I'll try to explain how Cypress in particular helped us with these. So first, we moved away from the page object model.
I'm so glad you said it, because I once wrote a blog post, stop using page object, and I'm still getting grief every week from people. Like,
we found that this is the way to go. I'll see if I can make a case for it.
Okay, you make a case. I'll keep quiet.
We made our test deterministic. We created better setups. We added some custom data QA selectors. We wised up to waiting. We started being smarter about how we wait. And we stopped focusing on the browser. Okay, so we'll get into each of these now. No more page object model. And Gleb, that article actually that you wrote was what got me thinking about this. And I feel like this is absolutely the way to go. We had used page object model in our previous repo with Selenium, but we moved away from it. So first, it takes longer to write. Every time you want to click on a button, you have to make a support function for doing it. Then you have to import the function to use in the actual test. And even just saying it like that makes it sound unnecessary to me. But when you're using something like Selenium, where clicking a button means that first you have to find the button, and then if it's not there, you have to wait for it to be there. And then you have to make sure that it's visible and clickable, and then you have to click on it. And so that's a fair bit of code that probably is better as an abstraction. But it's also difficult to debug since you've got to click into all of these support methods to see what's actually happening. And so you're clicking in and out of tests and trying to keep it all straight in your head when you're looking through, trying to debug your code. And finally, maybe most importantly, the page object model tends to lead to repeating things unnecessarily. So if I've got a single line support method for filling out and submitting a form, that's likely I'm going to use it. Instead of thinking about how can I get to that state without actually writing all that code for filling out the form. So it's not to say that support methods are completely gone from our repo, but we're very careful about them, and we don't view everything as page object model. And I think the takeaway here too is that with Cypress, it's just not necessary.
Right. And to be absolutely fair, you showed an examples of like setting up a user. All right. Some people will say, well, it's a page object, you're setting up a user. But it's like here and there. All right. Ordinarily, I don't think page object model adds you. And this example on this slide is actually great. So why don't you explain?
Okay. Yeah, no, that's a good point. We do have a handful of support methods that we do for creating users and signing in and that sort of thing. And those are great. Those should be reused. But when viewed as a kind of all or none, it's just not the way to go. So you can see in the top example, this code looks great, right?
Yeah.
You visit the login page, you enter your email, you enter your password, and you submit the form. Or maybe you click the submit button. I don't recall. And that's the problem. Whenever you add that layer of abstraction, you have to be really careful about naming. And you have to be careful not to include any additional steps. So like, is the email field cleared before the email is entered here? And if I wanted to clear the field in this case, but I didn't need to in the other cases, should I just make a flag for that here, or do I make a whole nother function? And this overhead is just totally unnecessary. And this is where Cypress shines, because Cypress reads just as easily without all of that overhead. So in the second example, you can see exactly what the test is doing. It's just as readable. It's easy to debug. You can add or remove steps to it for just the specific test. And so it's just much better all around.
Yeah, I agree. I might be partial, but to me, the bottom, which just uses Cypress commands, it's pretty much as readable as the top, and yet it's more flexible, and it doesn't require you to write additional wrappers around the page, which for you, the final user doesn't benefit or see at all. So good example.
Yep, exactly. So here's just a quick look at our old PHP automation that we used to run. So we just look at the first 4 lines, and we're using a test utility to enter some text. And that's just a wrapper for the native Selenium function to send keys. But we had some additional bits and bobs that we had originally hoped would help us write better, more resilient code if we wrap it in this enter text. So when we jump into that, now we have this big thing here. And in this case, if we're testing on a mobile device, we're actually doing something slightly different than if we're on desktop. That wasn't clear. And here we get to the meat of it. We are actually clearing the field first. That wasn't clear from this enter text. And then finally, we double check that the field actually contains the text that we just typed, unless we're in Firefox on Sauce Labs for some strange reason that I don't know. But this is why we're very careful about abstracting, because it's so easy to slip this in and you'll never see it again because you'll just be used to writing enter text, enter text.
Yeah.
And we did use this enter text over 200 times in our repo. And so I guess in Firefox and Sauce Labs, we just never verified.
And I have to add to this that this legacy function enter text, have you written tests for that? Right?
No.
Does it actually work? Exactly. So the more extra code you add, right, the more complex you write here, it's not being tested. At least with Cypress, we have a bunch of tests in every browser, right? Before we release, we try to make sure it works everywhere, right? So don't write your own code for testing websites.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Okay. Next change we made was to have deterministic tests. So first of all, random tests suck. Okay, maybe not really, but there's a time and place for randomization in tests, but it's not in CI. That's when you would just want to hit everything and watch the output to make sure that everything passes. It's difficult to debug. If you've got a failing test, you jump in, you rerun the test to watch what's happening, you check the output, but this time the test passes because it's using a different data set. This is just frustrating. So this isn't something that you really need Cypress for specifically, writing deterministic tests, but Cypress can help out because you can mock and stub. And so here's a little more of our old automation. I just brought this back to show that we had a bunch of conditionals in the code. And this is on top of some of these abstractions and support functions and things. But you've got your conditional here and another one here. And this is stepping through our donation flow. This was our end-to-end donation test. And you've got something here if you're donating to the widget or not. It gets really confusing. And like I said, we've got these abstractions in here as well. And so what are those actually doing? These widget fee calculations here. And so we'd have to click into those to find out what's going on, assuming we followed the path correctly. This is our current end-to-end donation that we updated when we got to Cypress. And so we're very particular about testing here. Here we're testing logged out using PayPal Giving Fund Payment Processor, that's PPGF. We're in US currency, we'll include a tip, and it's a one-time $25 donation. Everything is predetermined here. And we do have a similar test that does just about the opposite of everything. The user is logged in, we use a different processor, it's in Canadian dollars, it doesn't include a tip. And so by that, you know, hopefully we can cover a majority of the test cases kind of with a couple of tests. But you can see how easy this is to read. We find something that contains $25 and we click on it, and then we click continue. We put in our billing info, and you can see this isn't abstraction, right? This is exactly what the test is doing.
Yeah.
We put in our payment info. We find something that says donate, and we click on it, and then we check that the URL is correct. Okay, so this one I mentioned briefly earlier, but we wanted to make sure that we were setting everything up in a better way. And we actually didn't start by doing this, but we learned as we went that this was the way to go. So we don't use existing data since that can change. And we don't want to repeat the setup for every test where it's not necessary. If I only need one fundraising campaign to run my tests, then I don't want to create 3 different campaigns just because I've got 3 different tests. And here PHP unit specifically was a little stifling because of how we had to set everything up. And if you want to use PHPs before hooks, you have to use static functions. And we just weren't set up to do that. So we were actually building new users and new campaigns for every test. And so when we switched to Cypress, and again, because they integrate Mocha, you've got before and before each. And the best part is that you can nest them.
Yeah.
So we saw earlier when we walked through our test planning that you can definitely take use of this to make sure that you're setting up only what you need for specific tests. And it also makes it more clear when you're reading through the code what's part of the setup and what's part of the actual test that you're going to be executing. But we do find that this is a little more difficult and takes a bit more of a QA mind to do well. it just takes a little more thought. And so when developers go in and they want to just jump in and write tests, sometimes things get duplicated, and it does help to make sure that you're being smart about setup and only doing things once. Oftentimes you might have like a visit that happens a couple of times because you've included it in a before and then in a before each, etc.
So I guess you'll tell us that you'll catch it during pull request reviews.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's why we help QA. You know, we want to make sure that QA is in on those pull requests because we can catch those things. Another best practice is we added selectors just for testing. And this is something that really started to pick up speed once the developers were testers too, because they realized how difficult it is to single out an element that you want to click on. And so they can just add the specific selector directly to the element when they're in there, versus us having to ask them to add a selector, which just doesn't happen, right?
We had so many people commenting that the developer doesn't want to add a selector for me while I'm writing tests. But when you have to write a test, you add those selectors immediately.
That's right. And so this is good because classes and IDs can be hard to read. Something like div nth child to btn doesn't make much sense when you're reading through code, but when you can define your own selectors, you can name them whatever you want. And then the custom tags don't really change. And if they do, it's obvious that there's automation associated with them. So we use a data QA, and developers know that if something has a data QA, that as long as they don't touch that value, that we should be fine. And then with Cypress, it's easy to build your own sci.getTestID, or in our case, getDataQA. And I just wanted to call out, this is on Cypress document, best practices page. And it shows how classes and IDs aren't necessarily the best ID. So we try to follow this pretty closely. And then don't forget about the sci.contains is also a good option that we use pretty often. Okay, so we add to support commands. We'll add our data QA. So Cypress commands add, get data QA, and then we pass in a value and returns the standard sci.get with the value wrapped with the data QA selector.
Yeah.
And then it just works like magic, sci.getDataQA. And it's much more readable, easy to implement. You don't have to worry about doing some typo in this long bracketed data QA equals quotes. It's easy.
Todd, what's your opinion of Cypress testing library, right? Selecting by label, those commands. Are you using it, or you didn't need? What's your opinion?
Yeah, we're not using it, although it is something that I feel like that the developers actually need to adopt first. I view it as more of a guide to making sure that developers are writing accessible code, because if they're not, then it becomes really difficult when what you think is a button is actually just a div that looks nice. And so, if you're in a position where you can tell the developers, hey, this probably should be a button, it looks and functions like a button, and they'll make that change, then I don't know how much value you would get out of it. But we would like to use it. Smarter waiting. So earlier we had some support functions in our old automation repo that you might have seen, like a wait for element to appear, wait for element to be present, wait for element to vanish, etc. And again, we said, I wouldn't recommend creating all of those wrappers for native functions. That's just a bad idea. That was our mistake. But importantly, there's a lot of waiting that was explicit in the code. And this is one of those that Cypress does really well. You don't have to worry about waiting. You can say, get me a button that says go, and click on it. And as soon as there's a button that says go, Cypress clicks on it. And it's not explicit in the code. This is all, it doesn't take up any extra lines. But also with Cypress, you can use root aliases and assertions to help you wait for things. So some quick examples of that using aliases. So here, for example, we set up a root to watch for calls to get users. And we do this all the time. And then later when we need to make sure that that call is completed, we just say wait on the user's alias and continue on. And of course, you can also make assertions on that call, which is great too. And then here's what we do. Another thing that we do a fair amount is assert that something like a loading spinner is no longer visible. We have a lot of React apps where we load the page and the page load event fires kind of early. But we're still loading data, we're fetching that data. And so we throw this in just as a short assertion to make sure that anything with the loading class is not visible.
I have to warn about this particular example, right? You probably want to first make an assertion about something being visible, right? The loading indicator should be visible, then that it goes away. Because what can happen here is that initially it's invisible, the page is just locked, then it shows up, but the test already moved on because it's like, oh, yeah, it wasn't there when I test. So just be careful.
Right, great point. Okay, and finally, we said that we're not going to focus on the browser. Now, this one is pretty specific to our product and our users, but there's a good argument to be made in the QA community that cross-browser testing is for the birds. And we thought that sounded about right. We went through, go ahead.
Todd, it's the second point that's going to be controversial, but I'm so happy that it was your slide. You picked, like, I didn't prompt you, right? But yeah, why? Why do you think it's overrated?
Yeah, right. Well, so we went through all of our old bugs to see which ones were specific to a browser, and we had just a handful out of thousands of bugs in our database. And often it wasn't a functional error. It was a small style difference that may or may not have ended up being fixed anyway. So I would recommend doing that if you really feel like you need cross-browser testing. We also don't have a lot of mobile users. We're charity focused, and they tend to be a little more not as up to date. And because we're doing kind of website building and that sort of thing, that it doesn't play as well on mobile anyway. And so let's say you've got your suite of tests running in Chrome. It's really easy if you wanted to run in Firefox. Within a few minutes in most frameworks, you're up and running in both browsers and you feel great. Now you've got a bunch of extra coverage in Firefox and Chrome, except now you just doubled your runtime. And maybe, did you find any browser specific issues? Maybe not.
Did you add twice as many bugs? That's the question.
Right. Yeah, you maybe just doubled your failures as well. And of course, it's possible you have to make some updates to your test depending on what browser you want to test, which can make it hard to read, your tests hard to read, hard to debug. And again, is it worth it? If you have to click on something in Safari or Edge a little bit differently than Firefox, if there's no bug there and it just takes you, an extra 10 minutes to figure out how to click it differently, then we found that that just wasn't worth it. So it's not to say that we don't test against multiple browsers. I use Firefox as my default browser. And when I run Cypress locally, it runs Edge. And when we run Cypress in CI, we run Chrome. So I feel like
This is interesting.
Yeah, I feel like I still do some amount of cross-browser testing. I'm seeing most of our features in most of the browsers that are important to us, but we don't focus on cross-browser testing.
Mm-hmm.
And I do have an asterisk here because the one thing that Cypress is missing, of course, is Safari. And I'd love to be able to include that somewhere, especially if it was Safari iOS.
Yes.
That would be a game changer. Anytime soon, Gleb?
It's an open source project. Anyone who wants to add it can open a pull request. Okay, so everything has changed, right? You started with 5-hour, flaky 10% of tests randomly failing. What do you have today?
Okay, great. So our runtime went from 5 hours down to 10 minutes. That's the 30x from that title of the presentation, by the way. Mm-hmm. And most of that came from being smarter about our setups and smarter about waiting and not focusing on cross-browser testing.
All right. But also parallelization, right? Because you actually
Yeah,
split the tests.
and we were running parallel before, and now we're still running parallel. We run about 10 processes.
Gotcha.
Our test flake is usually next to nothing. Test flake is always an issue, and we're always trying to nip it in the bud when it comes up. But we usually see 1 to 2 failures, sometimes 5 or 6. And that's a lot of time that's due to something in the test environment that didn't go right, wasn't set up right, or the API drops for a minute or something like that. It's not usually because of something actually failing in Cypress or that our tests were not written correctly.
Todd, do you plan to try Cypress version 5 with test retries?
It's already in there, and I had the retries library already set up. That was a quick change, but yeah, we do absolutely take advantage of that.
Perfect.
And because we moved away from page object model and made our tests more deterministic, they're easier to read, easier to update, and easy to debug, which all adds up to more confidence, right? And faster feedback. So in conclusion, we wanted to get our developers writing tests. So we switched tools from Selenium and PHP WebDriver to Cypress, and we started to view QA in a more supportive role, helping developers set up and run tests, but ultimately leaving the testing up to them. And we wanted to gain more confidence with our tests, which we did by dropping page object model, making tests more deterministic, being smart about setups and waiting, using custom selectors, and stop focusing on cross-browser testing.
Well, Todd, this was excellent presentation. I'm really impressed with what you achieved and the advice that you actually distilled here. If people want to contact you, the best way is through LinkedIn?
Yeah, I don't do social media, so LinkedIn is great. And I don't have a blog or anything, so.
Okay, so you know where to find Todd, but let's maybe spend the last 10 minutes. We have a bunch of questions, right? Please vote on the questions that you find interesting. Todd, anything that catches your eye from the top questions that you want to answer?
Let's see.
Maybe you can tell us more about the pull request process. That seems to be the top question right now.
Yeah. Yeah, so because we're writing tests while we're developing, we create PRs to go through, so that we're consistently adding to the tests and updating the tests and making sure that those pass, so that we're not getting to the end of a feature and the tests are not written, right? So by the time we wrap up a feature, all of the tests are written and they should be passing at that point. Gotcha. Best practices for reviews. Yeah, usually I'll just pull it in locally and run it against the test environment and see if anything stands out. The DOM snapshots help a lot to make sure that you're testing what you actually think you're testing,
right,
and making sure that things can fail. That's an easy one to miss.
Excellent. Actually, here's a question, right? That number 2 that I'll pull. Do you run the same test suites in different environments, right? Or do you run just locally and on PRs? What happens there?
Yeah, so we actually have 5 or 6 different test environments that we keep up and running. We don't test in production, but we have a test environment that mimics production that we test in. And then we have different test environments for our different teams. And so they can host the features that they're working on and run the Cypress tests against those environments. And so we have a bit of an interesting config where when we launch Cypress, we specify which config file we want to point to. And that gives us the right base URL and the right variables for connecting to the database and everything.
Perfect. So this is one of the QA supporting roles. Is like, make sure you can spin up a separate testing environment easily. Like that's high value of QA team. Maybe, can you answer this one? Do you have any accessibility driven testing, right? So you kind of mentioned Cypress testing library already, right? Do all your selectors are based on like site-contains or data QA attributes?
Yeah, we use site-contains when we can. And of course, adding the data QA attributes, that just keeps, as we build those features, we're adding those more and more. For some of the test features that were already in there before we made these changes, you know, those data QA elements don't exist yet. But yeah, in terms of accessibility driven testing, I think, again, if you can get developers on board, you know, if you were starting out with this and you said, we want to use React testing library to do this in building our new features, or sorry, Cypress testing library, then I think that would help, but you want it on the developers first to make sure that they're writing accessible elements, creating accessible elements before you try to access them with those accessible selectors.
Gotcha. Any other question that, oh, here's one. Do you have any examples that are publicly available by any chance? Or any blog posts or anything to go?
I don't think so, but it's a good question, and I can see about getting something available.
So what will happen later with this webinar, we will get the recording, right, as a video. The slides are public, and we'll put the link to the slides, and we'll publish it on our Cypress blog. So if you have a larger test example, Todd, we'll be very happy to include it in that blog post so people can see it.
Okay,
So
sure.
just let us know.
Great. Yeah, we can do this next one on getting developers to start seeing testing as important versus an afterthought. When QA writes the test, sets up the test framework first, we hand developers the tests, and when there's an expectation that this thing needs to be tested by the time it goes out, and here are the tests, and you just need to really fill in the blanks with it. You don't really have to think about it. It's not going to take much time.
Right.
And QA can help fill in the tests as well. Of course, we don't just go completely hands off. But I think developers start seeing the test as important when they start running those tests and seeing how it can help them. When they're not writing the tests at all, right? It's hard to go from 0 to 60. When we just go from 0 to 10 with that little bit of push in the right direction and say, here's all of your tests. They're all failing right now, but you just need to swap in some variables, add some selectors. You can go as far as writing, I know I'm going to need to click on this button and fill in these fields. And I don't know what the selectors are going to be yet. I don't know what the IDs are going to be, or the data QA elements, whatever you use. But we can often imagine, especially if we have designs, we can often imagine that these are going to be the steps that I need to do. And so you don't even need to include those in comments. You can just go, depending on how much time you have, you can go and you can write out those tests from start to finish. They'll be failing, but then developers make a few changes and they're passing. And so you almost have this test-driven development model. And it just, the more that happens, the more everyone sees the tests as important.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one or maybe two more questions, so we finish before the top of the hour. Anything from the top questions that you find?
Yeah. How not to repeat code using POM without using page object model. You don't repeat your code. It's fine. There's no need to be super dry when especially just in QA in general, because you want to be able to say, QA as a process is very repeated, right? We want to go through the same steps with minor changes. And so, we copy and paste a lot with those minor changes. But when you go back and you debug, the argument is that, well, what if a selector changes and now you need to go and you need to update all these files and all these things? First of all, you probably shouldn't need to update a bunch of files. If one selector changes, that's probably just in one app, which should live in one file. And second of all, you've got maybe 5, 6, 10 tests that you have to replace the selector. That I find that to be easier than creating this abstraction because more often you'll want to see what the test is actually doing, and being explicit about what's actually happening in the test is just much more important to us than not repeating code.
Gotcha. Well, we're out of time. Thank you, Todd, so much for your excellent presentation and for answering our viewers' questions. We'll post the recording online. We'll put it on our YouTube channel. And we wish our viewers, and Todd, to you, like safe and happy rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you, Todd, so much.
Thanks so much.
Take care, everyone.